Okay, thank you, Joseph. Well, I see pretty much the same faces for the first presentation. So you already know a little bit about gratitude. We spent time earlier today, although we do have some new people here also. So the topic of optimism is also a foundation in positive psychology. And what I'd like to do in this presentation, similar to what we did with gratitude, is to give you a sense of what do we know about what optimism is, what impact it has on psychological functioning, also on our physical health. I found a study when I was preparing this lecture just last week that was done very recently out of Boston University Medical School on the importance of optimism for longevity. So fascinating research. It hasn't permeated the media yet. So you're probably among the first people in the world to know about this. And actually has very significant implications. Well, we'll get to that in the presentation. And similar to what we did with gratitude, I'd like to offer some ways to look at how optimism develops in human beings, some possible pathways. True for gratitude, we don't know very much about the origins of optimism. But there is this view now that if you have children, the single most important thing you can do as a parent is to raise a child with strong optimism. It may be that will influence everything in that child's life as they get older. And what does this mean? Well, there's some very interesting consequences. So we can talk about that also. And as we did in the first presentation, I have activities that you can do here today that will take a little time that will help to boost your optimism. So when you leave here this afternoon, you'll be a more optimistic person than when you came in, something you probably weren't expecting. Okay, so we begin with Alfred Adler. Freud said nothing about optimism, and he actually was a little bit contemptuous of it. He thought that optimism was an illusion, that the world is a pretty miserable place. If you know Freud's outlook on life, he had a very pessimistic view, and it influenced many areas of psychological research and interest. I was telling one of your colleagues yesterday that I've been publishing research for a couple of years on the phenomena of tears of joy. This is when people cry from happiness. I'm not trying to compliment myself, but I think I'm one of the first people in the history of psychology who's actually done some empirical work on this. And I've published studies now in India and Japan, and maybe I'll join with a colleague here in Hong Kong. But in the early psychoanalytic view, the first studies on tears of joy that were published in the 1950s by psychoanalysts said that there's no such thing as tears of joy. It's only a cover for happiness. I mean, it's only a cover for sadness. It's not true happiness. And they gave the example of people who cry, the father who cries at his daughter's wedding. They said he's not crying out of happiness, he's crying out of sadness that he's losing his special girl, and some man who's not even in the family now is going to control his or dominate his daughter's life. So in the 1950s, it was still influenced by psychoanalytic views, which came from Freud, a very pessimistic view of life. Adler was living at the same time as Freud. He was younger and he didn't live quite as long as Freud did. After I wrote my biography of Maslow, I was looking for a new book project, and I discovered that there hadn't been a biography of Adler in over 30 years. And the timing for me was very good because there was a best-selling biography of Freud. It was written by Peter Gay. It's a wonderfully detailed book. He wrote very well. and it's about a 700-page book. I don't think the publishers expected it, but it became a bestseller in the United States. And so at that time, my agent contacted several publishers. They knew Adler wasn't as famous as Freud, but they figured, all right, maybe a book on Adler will sell 1/4 as many copies and it'll still make them a lot of money. So I had 4 publishers bidding for rights to my biography of Adler. It actually didn't sell very well, but now all of a sudden in Southeast Asia, Adler is more popular than ever. And my book this year is being translated in China. It's been finished. They're just waiting for permission from the government because I'm an American, and it's being held up now. It was published in the summer in South Korea. It was published in Romania also. So even though I wrote this book in 1989, I think, all of a sudden it's being translated all over the world. And it should be, because Adler's work really holds up. Even though he died in 1937, I think he understood children better than any thinker in the 20th century. And I learned a lot as a clinical psychologist and as a parent in studying Adler's life. So having said that, Adler was an optimist by nature. He was described this way by the media in the United States. He moved from Austria to the United States in the last 10 years of his life, and he predicted that the future of psychology in the world would be in the United States. And he was right about that. At that time, it was in Vienna, where Freud was from, and Adler, but he said it was going to move to the United States. So Adler was really the first theorist in the 1920s and 1930s to talk about optimism as a key trait of healthy psychological functioning. Very interesting. He himself was described as a bubbling optimist, someone who was filled with optimism about the future of psychology and about his own work. Well, I touched some. Okay. So I think it's useful to spend a few minutes to see what did Adler say about optimism, in particular because at this point positive psychology doesn't have a lot of data about the early aspects of optimism. We know that people differ on what's called trait optimism. And it's a continuum. So what I mean by that, some people in this room are very high on optimism as a trait, as a basic feature of their personality. Other people in this room are very low on trait optimism. And many people are then in the middle. But where does that come from? And is it good to be all the way high? We'll talk about that. It certainly is not good to be low. And there's a lot of interest, though, and some controversy in psychology about where we should be on this continuum. So Adler was one of the first people to talk about optimism as a vital feature of healthy personality functioning. He saw optimism as based on early experience in the family. How much physical affection, how much attention, how much encouragement, how much praise is given to the child. And he was one of the first theorists to see that this could differ by siblings. This is why siblings are very different, something that's been noticed for many decades. There's not high similarity necessarily between siblings on basic personality traits. And Adler's view was that parents don't treat their children the same, that some of the differences reflect differences in parenting. Even though the children are living under the same roof, they're experiencing different types of parenting from the mother and different types from the father. He also felt that optimism is nurtured by the schools, by teachers. And in the 1930s, he strongly advocated that schools become involved in helping to strengthen psychological functioning in children. Now, this still hasn't happened in the United States. As I mentioned earlier today, schools are starting to look at gratitude now and to think of activities. But on the whole, schools have not been very involved in trying to create healthy psychological functioning, at least in my country. The focus has been on teaching academic skills. In particular, Adler felt that warmth and encouragement were key elements in helping children to develop an optimistic personality. Again, what we call today trait optimism. And he felt that teachers could have a powerful role. Most teachers don't, but it is possible for individual teachers to strengthen children to have an optimistic personality. Adler's overall system of personality was, by definition, an optimistic view. He felt that we all can learn to manage our lives and to take control over the direction of our lives. We can think of Adler, in a sense, as the founder of self-help. He wasn't the only one. Karen Horney also, in the 1940s, talked about self-help, self-analysis, keeping a journal of your dreams and keeping a journal to help you grow psychologically. But Adler, before Horney, had this emphasis on individual self-help. And so optimism ties into that. If you're not optimistic, you don't believe that you can become a psychologically stronger person. And I think this is one reason why Adler in particular, Adlerian theory, is gaining so much attention in Southeast Asia, because these are very new concepts. And my understanding in working with people in South Korea or China is that a lot of younger people are interested in self-help and developing skills to become more successful. Adler also talked about social interest as an important part of self-help. In other words, it's not simply focused on the self, but it's learning how to help other people, learning to develop social skills, social awareness. His famous motto was, "Any child can learn anything." Now, he didn't mean this to be true literally. So with your population, he wasn't crazy. He had school psychologists, social workers who worked with children who were mentally slow. Children today, we would say, were developmentally disabled. But he felt that this should be a motto for teachers, to have this confidence that basically most children can be taught things, and not to blame children if they don't grasp concepts. In Adler's view, early interactions with family members, peers, school teachers, and others, as well as biological factors, shape our personality and influence our optimism. So he did have a medical view, being trained as a medical doctor, that we are influenced by weaknesses that we have physically, that can have an effect on us. This comes up often with children that I see who are victims of bullying. And I know this is a major problem now all over the world. It's been dealt with pretty well in the United States in the last 5 years. School systems all over the United States have written policies that teachers have to follow to report bullying. Doesn't mean it's not happening anymore, but it's being taken very seriously. And of course, many of the children that I see that are victims of bullying are physically weak. They're smaller than other children. They're scrawnier, skinnier, smaller. Last week I evaluated a boy who I could tell that he would be a victim of bullying, and he told me that he is, because he's smaller and skinnier than children his age are, boys his age are. And I did some advice or counseling. His mother was in the room also. So he can't help that. He's born this way. Maybe he'll get bigger, but not necessarily. So Adler knew that our physical makeup, physical factors can have an influence on our personality and can influence our optimism. So the fact that he is small and skinny for his age would certainly have an impact on how optimistic he sees his life. Now, in positive psychology today, we talk about self-efficacy, very important term. If you asked me to name the 10 most important concepts, or 20 in positive psychology, it would include self-efficacy. It's not the same thing as self-confidence or self-esteem. It's not totally different. It was developed by Bandura. You probably have heard of him. He's still alive. I think he's close to 90, but he developed many, many brilliant concepts of psychology. He's the father of social learning theory, which I was very impressed with in graduate school. And it's my orientation as a therapist. I see that as how children develop behaviors based on role modeling. So what self-efficacy means is how much do you feel you can handle the challenges of your life? If you're a college student, your challenge is being a student. It means getting good grades. It means learning the material, coming out of school with a degree and maybe continuing to graduate school. If you're older, it means that you can handle work responsibilities. You have resilience to cope with stress. Not only in Hong Kong, but all over the world, stress is inescapable now in work, in all places in the world. So the question is, how well can you handle stress? Do you give up, or do you find ways to cope with it? Do you ask for help? Do you look for advice, or do you just give up? And we'll talk about what are the strategies that people low on optimism have. They have different ways of trying to cope with stress, ways that aren't very effective compared to optimistic people. So Bandura's concept, then, self-efficacy, is kind of an outgrowth of Adler's idea that children who are optimistic develop confidence in their ability to cope with stresses in life. There's a lot of research, if you want to look tonight or over the next week, about self-efficacy and optimism. It comes up over and over again. So the two are very closely linked. In other words, if you want to have more confidence in your ability, if you're a student here, to be a successful student or to be successful in your career, then you need to boost your optimism. It will increase your self-efficacy as well. Very interesting. Bandura said that self-efficacy based on optimism may be more important than realism in order to be a high achiever. In other words, if you're a high optimist, you'll believe you can do something, even if you really aren't able to, you'll work at it, you'll persevere, and then you'll be able to, even though right now you're not able to. In other words, it'll give you the ability to hope that you'll be successful. So if I were not high in optimism, I wouldn't have come here. I would have just felt this is too much to come and try to prepare these lectures. And maybe I wasn't able to do it in the summer, but I worked at it, and I think I put all the pieces together. So I've never presented on these two topics before as complete presentations. So I think he's right. In other words, optimism gives us the ability to reach further, to achieve goals for ourselves, where someone low in optimism won't bother to. They'll just stick to what they know, and that's okay, but they won't be very high achievers. That's Bandura's view of why optimism ties in so much to self-efficacy. In Adler's view, optimism is especially important in giving you the courage and hope to have satisfying social relationships. Adlerian psychology is basically all about social relationships, how well you can work with other people, how successful you are to maintain friendships, how much you contribute to your community. Do you know other people in your community, in your field, with colleagues? It's all about that. It's not just self-development. In Adler's view, persons with low optimism have not experienced sufficient warmth and encouragement in childhood. So they don't make the effort because they feel they won't be successful. As I mentioned, I think Adler understood children better than any other thinker of the 20th century. In Adler's view, people who have experienced little warmth and affection and encouragement develop a negative worldview, a pessimistic worldview, or a cynical worldview. And therefore, they don't make the effort to go beyond what they feel secure with. So this is very important. In the last few years, I've published several studies looking at the worldviews of people in different countries, in particular what metaphors they view for life. So one of the ways that we look at whether you have an optimistic view of life is what metaphor do you use to describe life? This comes from Adlerian theory, that it comes from the first few years of our life. We develop an outlook on what life is about and how we're going to cope with life as we grow up and get older. So in therapy, Adlerians are very interested in the metaphors that people use to describe their relationships and to describe their environment. And there are many, many studies that have looked at the metaphors that people use in business, in health, in looking at family life. So what I'd like you to do, we'll take a little break from the lecture for a couple of minutes. The question is, if I say to you, life is like blank, write a few words to describe what you would answer. Now, I'll tell you right now, the most common answer all over the world is what? Life is a what? Journey. And there have been studies in Russia. I did a study in China with teachers that was just published, another study in South America, the United States, all over the world, in very different cultures, say that the most common response, but not the majority, but the most frequent, is that life is a journey. It's not my favorite metaphor, by the way. And the way I've explained this with my co-authors, perhaps, is this can be explained by the field of evolutionary psychology, that we have survived as a species because people have migrated from one place to another to look for food, to find shelter. So it may be that we're hardwired to see life like this. So if you see life as a journey, you're in good company. That seems to be the most common metaphor. But I developed a survey of 17 different life metaphors, and that's only one of them. So I'd like you to just take a minute. Most people can do this. Not everyone can, but from my research, most people are able to describe what their preferred metaphor for life is. So if you want to write journey, that's okay. Now, if you want, I can list some of the metaphors that I've been able to identify. Would you like me to do that? Okay, so we can... Let's start with a super optimistic metaphor. And again, there may be some cultural differences, but the study was what I did this past summer with a teacher in China. She gave it to 60 teachers in a primary school, and it was very well replicated with 60 teachers, an earlier study in South America, and the cultures are completely different. So this may be tapping into something universal. Can you think of, for you, what would be a very, very optimistic metaphor for life? I'll tell you a couple that I came up with. But anyone want to think of one? And actually, very few people see life this way. Any of you think of one? Very optimistic? I'm sorry. Okay, you're close. Even more optimistic. One that I developed was life is a day at the beach. Okay, some people have seen that as their favorite or their preferred metaphor, but it's pretty rare. It's an extremely positive metaphor, and it's not really realistic. For most people, unless you're a billionaire, life is not a day at the beach. You have to work to earn a living, and it's not the same as lying on the beach in the sun. So that would be an example of an extremely optimistic life metaphor. Can you think of a... Okay, so we have a theme park.
Life is a party, life is a game.
Yeah, we had that. Life is a party. And that's also not chosen by many people either, but it's extremely optimistic. Life is a song or a dance. And some people do see life that way, but not the majority. Okay, what would be some very pessimistic metaphors for life? And I have to tell you, the most pessimistic was the sample of teachers in China. So, and the article's been published. You can see how I interpret it, my colleagues and I. But can you think of what would be the most pessimistic metaphors for life? Oh, much worse than that. Well, we had a war. The other one was a prison. And the highest frequency of any sample were the teachers in China, about 10%. That was their metaphor. Life is a prison. Okay, so those would be very negative life metaphors. Ones that are in the middle would be life is a journey. Okay, so we mentioned that. It's sort of neutral. We also had life as a school. That's one of my preferred metaphors. Life is an adventure. That's also one of my preferred ones. Okay. So I'm talking about this because in the Adlerian view, these metaphors don't come out of nowhere. They come out of our early experience or sometimes later experience when we're in teenage years or college years. We develop a perspective on what life is about. And based on the life metaphors people tell you, you have clues to their optimism or pessimism. Generally, the studies that I've done with my colleagues, we did one study with student leaders in college. Another study was done with medical students in college, and 2 studies with teachers. Generally, they're all high on optimism because these are fields that if you're not high, you wouldn't go into it. And I know this, as I've mentioned earlier today, my parents were teachers. If you don't believe that children can learn and you can have an impact on them, you wouldn't go into the field of education. It's not high paying anywhere in the world. It's an idealistic field. But people who like being around children feel that they're having an impact on children's lives. So it makes sense that these are optimistic people. And to go into medicine, you have to believe that you can help people. You can cure them, or you can relieve their pain or suffering. So the studies that we've done are consistent with what we'd expect for people in those fields. So again, if you want to know your own optimism, and there are self-report scales also, one way is to look at your metaphors for life, and this is an important clue. And I've often, when I lecture, Adler was correct in that these metaphors that we choose have nothing to do with intelligence. They reflect personality, again, what today is called trait optimism. And I gave a lecture, let's see, where was I? It was in China, I think, 2 years ago. And one student in the lecture room said that he had read a book written by a philosopher and it disagreed with what I was saying. And I said, well, I think that I'm correct because our metaphors have nothing to do with how smart we are. That very smart people can have very pessimistic views of life. And because he looked like he was in his early 20s, I said it would be good for you not to take this viewpoint seriously for your own life. If you have a pessimistic view of life, it's not going to help you as you go through life. As we look at the data I present to you, you'll see why this makes sense. As I mentioned earlier, now psychologists say if there's one thing you can do for your children, it's to give them an optimistic view of life. So for this college student to say that he's very impressed by this philosopher who has an extremely pessimistic view of life, that's a very destructive attitude for him to have. I didn't mind saying that. Okay, again, just to finish about the Adlerian view, in Adler's view, people make mistakes in life, and they can correct mistakes. It's what I call an educational model. So we believe that if you're not high on optimism, you can boost your optimism. In positive psychology, earlier today I talked about Seligman's view about gratitude. The same thing, there have been techniques developed to raise people's optimism. And again, the Adlerian view is very consistent. Adler's model is what I would call an educational model, okay, not a medical model. And here's what I mean by that. If you're having trouble in math, right, some of you had trouble when you were in school, you're laughing. A medical model would say it's because you're sick, you're disabled in some way. And there are people, and it's in my specialty, who have a particular disability in math. It does exist, but it's pretty rare. Most kids who are doing badly in math are frustrated, they're not trying, or they're giving up. And if that's the case, the Adlerian view would say they just have to slow down and see what they're doing wrong, and then they correct it. Most of us learn how to get through math until we go to college, unless we want to take more courses in college in math. But most of us learn math and we pass the courses. So it's an educational model that sees difficulties as mistakes that can be corrected. Okay, so here's what becomes relevant. People who are low on optimism, that's a mistake in Adler's thinking, in the Adlerian psychological approach. Life is full of possibilities and opportunities. It's very important to understand that, and it comes from Adler's view. Now, some of you weren't raised that way, but in Adler's view, that's a mistake. And if you're young, it's easier to correct mistakes. I was talking with a psychologist last month, and he said, Dr. Hoffman, age really matters on this, doesn't it? Doesn't it become harder to become more optimistic the older you get? You're really talking, people in their 20s can benefit the most from this. And I said, I wouldn't disagree with you, but Adler had patients who were middle-aged or older, and he, again, was optimistic that they can correct their mistakes. But it's very important to see that, because we often don't think of this as a mistake, having a pessimistic view of life, or at least not having an optimistic or very cautious view of life. So it becomes very relevant in looking at the antecedents of optimism to look at the model that Adler presented. In my biography of Adler, I was very much taken by a comment that he made. He once said that sometimes the greatest mistake in life is to be too cautious. Sometimes the greatest mistake in life is to be too cautious. Now, he exemplified this. His parents were not famous. They never went to college. Similar to Freud's parents, they owned a small business. And yet, through the force of his own ideas and personality, he became one of the most important thinkers of the 20th century in the field of psychology, social work, family relationships, even in healthcare. The more we understand the link between mind and body. And he couldn't have done this without being an extremely optimistic person. So he was not a cautious person. This doesn't mean that you just don't have to worry about risks. And we'll talk about that today. It is possible to be too optimistic. So today we talk about realistic optimism. So if we see optimism as a continuum, it's probably better to be over here. This is very high and this is very low. Not to be, if it's a 10-point scale, we probably should be about an 8 at the highest, not a 9 or a 10. And I teach this to my students. There are two areas of life where this becomes very relevant. Can you think of the two areas where you should not, on a 10-point scale, not be a 10 on optimism, where it's disadvantageous? Anyone want to try and think of what the research shows? Well, I'll tell you that. One area is with money or finances. If you believe that everything will turn out great for you, you'll take unreasonable risks with your money, and you'll end up losing all your money. You'll end up investing in things that won't be successful, whether it's the stock market, real estate, gambling, all these aspects with money. If you're extremely optimistic, very, very high, you'll believe that everything will turn out okay financially, no matter what you do. And that's not true. Okay, so that's one area where we know that it's good to be somewhat optimistic. I'm not sure about how economics and investment works in Hong Kong, but I think similar to the United States, if you just put your money in a bank account, you'll get a certain interest rate, but you'll never really get much on your return. You have to go beyond just putting your money in a savings account. That's the lowest return you'll get. It is the most secure. So that kind of makes sense. You need to have some optimism, but you can't have unrealistic optimism. Can you think of another area? And this is talked about more by psychologists and people in healthcare in particular. Why do you need to have what would be considered realistic optimism in another area of life, besides having to do with money? Exactly. And there is evidence, as I say, more studies published on this, that very high optimism people have worse health than the ones who are somewhat lower. Why is that so? What would be the explanation? There's several ways that this can be explained. Now, if you're young, you probably don't think about this, but you can think about this for your parents or grandparents. If you're 21, you don't really have to worry about your health at all, so you probably have never given it any thought. But as you get older, you have to give this a lot more thought. So why are people who are extremely high, beyond reasonably high optimism, why do they have worse health? And this has been shown now in a variety of studies. Okay, they don't go to the doctor, they don't get checkups because they think everything's going to turn out fine, so why should I worry? Why do I need a checkup? Because nothing bad can happen to me. So, and many illnesses can, if they're caught early, the doctors can do a lot than if they're not caught early. So that's one thing. Second thing is, if they're prescribed medication, they don't take it. This is a big problem in the United States. It's a very high percentage. I think it may be 50% of people who are prescribed medication don't take it. It's called non-compliance. And it may be because of the optimism, being too optimistic. A third, it's felt, is with lifestyle. If you believe nothing bad can happen to you, you can smoke, you can eat too much food, you cannot exercise because it doesn't matter. Everything, you'll still be very healthy. And we know that that's not true. So this idea now, I think the medical field may be going too much to the extreme now, saying don't be optimistic at all. And I'm actually a little worried when I read these articles that they're making people overly cautious. But again, we have this view now that we need to have optimism that is realistic. And I don't think Adler would have disagreed with that. Okay, one of the areas that optimism comes in the field of humanistic psychology is with Maslow's work. So he built his theory in part on Adler's work. He worked closely with Adler after he got his PhD. He was starting off as a professor. So these are some of the aspects about Maslow's life. We talked about Maslow a little, of course, earlier today. So in particular, Maslow talked about peak experiences as having an impact on people's optimism. So earlier today I had the group here do an activity to identify a peak experience. In Maslow's view, the more peak experiences we have, the more hopeful we become about life, the more optimistic. Hope and optimism are often put together. There's some difference, but the basic idea is they're positive feelings about the future. And that in Maslow's view, having a peak experience elevates mental health, including boosting our optimism. So if you want to become more optimistic, try to have more peak experiences. And this strengthens your sense that life is worthwhile, it's filled with good things that can happen to you. Maslow also noted that the more psychologically healthy we are, the more likely we are to have peak experiences. So both of these are true. Psychologically healthy people have more peak experiences, and peak experiences in turn make us more psychologically healthy, including having a more hopeful and optimistic view of life. This becomes very relevant to positive psychology today because Maslow felt peak experiences are an important remedy to overcome many types of addictions. He felt that one reason that people suffer from addictions is they don't have enough peak experiences. So they turn to drugs or alcohol as a way to soothe themselves. Also, loss of meaning in life. He felt that peak experiences often give us a greater sense of meaning. There's a lot of interest now in positive psychology in life meaning. This becomes especially important as people get older. Now, meaning in positive psychology refers to whether you feel that your life has meaning, not in a philosophical way, whether human life ultimately has meaning or not. That's a philosophical question. But more relevant to psychological well-being is whether you feel that your life has meaning. And there's a lot of interest now in ways to measure this. So that's very, very important, especially as people get older. The loss of meaning is devastating psychologically to people. And the third area where peak experiences become relevant, Maslow identified, have to do with depression and anxiety. People suffering from depression often go through long periods with little joy, little sense of optimism. Okay, so this we touched on earlier today. With gratitude, I mentioned Seligman was interested from the beginning in gratitude as an important trait of psychological well-being. And this has also been true for optimism. Okay. Okay, so in positive psychology, optimism fits into this. The focus, the shift has been from looking at sickness to looking at health. So there's been a lot of research on pessimism and optimism as factors having to do with physical health. I'll get to this in a little while, but as I mentioned, a new study showed that optimism may be an important predictor of longevity. Very exciting research because I think everyone wants to have a long life. So, and it's been found very clearly that pessimism is associated with poor physical health. Now, we talked briefly about why it's not good to be over here for optimism. But why is it not good to be over here in terms of influencing health? why are people very low on optimism more likely to have poor physical health? So we've given some discussion about why you may not be smart to be overly optimistic, but why do pessimistic people very low on optimism, why are they more likely to have poor physical health? Can you think of some explanations? Yeah, the basic idea is why bother, it doesn't matter. If I'm going to be sick anyway, I'm going to die at a young age anyway, so what's the point? I'll eat whatever I want to. I won't exercise. I won't have good social relationships. And I actually know people like this myself. And as Adler was right, this has nothing to do with IQ or intelligence. And sure enough, these are people I know whose health is much worse than other people because they have a pessimistic view. Some of it has to do with looking at one's family. And I think this is, clinically, I've found this over the years. I've never seen any discussion of this in the psychological literature. So all of you know how long your grandparents lived if they're no longer alive, or as you get older, how long your parents lived. And I find that this influences people very often in their expectation of how long they'll live and also choices that they make as they get older. A very good friend of mine keeps saying both his father and his father's father died by the time they were 70. And he said to me that part of him feels why bother, because that's his cutoff point. And he was a smoker in college. He doesn't exercise. He's been overweight for most of his adult life. And he eats a lot of junk food. And I told him, I visited him this summer, I said, look, and he's a very intelligent person. I said, the fact that your father and grandfather lived to 70 scientifically does not limit your life expectancy. He said, I know that, but I can't help feeling that it will. So there are many people like this who have this viewpoint. So it will have an effect on how they take care of themselves. So he is pessimistic about his personal longevity, and that will influence on a day-to-day basis his lifestyle and his physical well-being. Optimism also is linked to psychological distress versus happiness. There's a lot of research that optimistic people are happier. They have higher subjective well-being. And this makes sense because if you're faced with some challenge or difficulty, if you're optimistic, you feel that it won't be permanent. Seligman's view of what's called explanatory style. And we'll talk about that in a little while. And that seems to have a lot to do with psychological well-being. So if you want to be a happier person, you need to be more optimistic also. I think all parents say they want their children to grow up to be happy people. So it comes up again that it means that you want to raise a child who has an optimistic view about his or her life. And finally, conflict versus harmony. So optimistic people are better at solving conflicts. They're more willing to think that it can be resolved than if you're pessimistic. And we'll talk about that. It gets problem-solving strategies, this is what we call it, are very important when you're faced with conflicts. What do you do if you get into an argument with your friend? There are different ways you can cope with this. Some are healthy and some are not healthy. So in these three areas, optimism definitely ties in. Okay, this we can skip here. Okay, so now we'll talk more specifically. What do we know about optimism today? Since Seligman launched positive psychology in 1998, optimism has been one of the most closely studied and researched areas of positive psychology. Seligman developed the concept of explanatory style, and it's been a very powerful concept. It's been used in many areas of business and social life. Basically, it means, how do we interpret the bad things that happen to us, the unfortunate kinds of events, the negative events? Everyone experiences these in life. You can't go through life without experiencing negative events. The question is, how do you interpret them? So, in other words, this is looking at the past. There's also an element of optimism that looks at the future. It's called expectancy. So it's fascinating. One area of optimism is past-oriented, and the other is future-oriented. So this idea of explanatory style. So let's just take a minute. Just write down on your paper a negative event that happened to you, or to you personally. It could be financial, it could be interpersonal, it could be with school or a career. If you're a student, it might be failing a course or getting a low grade in a course. If you're working, it could be fired from your job or not getting a promotion. In social life, it could be that a relationship ended, a divorce, separation, things that happen to you personally. The question is, how do you interpret those? Okay, so just take a minute and write something, because I feel that it's more meaningful when we actually become psychologically engaged with these theories. So just write something that negative, bad that happened to you personally. So, okay, I'll give you a minute to do that, to think of something. Okay, so, and this has become one of the most powerful areas of positive psychology, explanatory style. So, what Seligman calls, the goal is to have a positive, optimistic explanatory style. Now, there are three components to it. The first one was, do you blame or do you see the fault as lying with external forces or due to yourself internally? And again, this is a general model. It doesn't mean in every case it's applicable. It's a way of looking at life as we go through life, looking at the negative events. So it's not saying you should never accept responsibility, but there's some people who always blame themselves for everything. And in positive psychology now, this is a term, self-compassion. We could have a whole presentation on that. I've been very interested in that in the last year. I haven't done any research on it, but when I was going through the new edition of my book on positive psychology with Dr. Compton, I found in the last 5 years there's a lot of empirical research on self-compassion, which means, do you treat yourself kindly, or are you always finding fault with yourself, putting yourself down, blaming yourself? So this is what Seligman is talking about, that it's not psychologically healthy to go through life when you experience the ups and downs of life, to do constantly blaming yourself for things that didn't work out. I was just talking with one of my students a couple of weeks ago who said that he didn't get a job interview that he was really hoping for, a part-time job. And he was saying, Dr. Hoffman, what did I do wrong? Can you give me a few minutes and help me? I said, you may not have done anything wrong. They may have been planning to hire someone else. Maybe the boss's nephew is applying for the job. They'll never tell you. If they tell you, you can end up suing their company. They don't know, but you'll never know. I said, if you get 5 job interviews and you still don't have a single offer, something is wrong there. I said, are you talking about 1 interview or 5? He said, no, just this 1 interview, but I really wanted it, and I don't know why I didn't get the job. I said, you probably will never know, and you just have to move on. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. He is thinking to blame himself, and it's probably not psychologically healthy to do that. I just said, did you come on time? Did you dress appropriately? Did you know about the company? He said, yes, but I didn't get the offer. I said, so you don't know what their hidden agenda might have been. Okay, so again, when you look at your own explanatory style, do you generally blame yourself, or do you accept that maybe it had nothing to do with you, and you just kind of move on? You move on in life. Seligman believes that the optimistic style is someone who tends not to blame himself or herself. Overall, again, not in every situation, but overall, it's better to not to have the self-blame, but to look at it as due to external causes. The second part is it's better to believe that it's temporary. It's a temporary setback than that it's permanent. This comes up often with divorce counseling. One person feels that they'll never find someone again in their life, that the marriage ended, and that they're doomed to be alone because of that. And it's psychologically healthier to believe that it was a specific incident, a specific relationship, and there are lots of people that you may be more compatible with, that you can fall in love with and that will fall in love with you. Or with students, I say if you're having difficulty in a course, there are bad professors, and most professors know that. I know that. It may have nothing to do with you, or it just could have been you didn't do well in statistics, and just forget about it. There are lots of other courses. It's a temporary setback. So it's healthier with the optimistic outlook to feel that it's not going to last forever, that it was a temporary setback. And the third part that Seligman identifies is that you need to compartmentalize the event and not generalize it. In clinical psychology in the 80s, there was the view that people who compartmentalize their life, that's not good. And now it turns out it is good. And that's a way of coping with the uncertainties of life. Because you just ended let's say you just ended a relationship. It has nothing to do with how much money you'll make this year. They're two completely separate events. If you focus on it too much, then you can't work effectively. You don't pay attention at work. You become depressed. People don't like to be around someone who's depressed, and then it can spill over. So we're finding that sometimes the most advantageous thing is to compartmentalize negative events in your life. And people fail to do that sometimes. So I see some of you look a little puzzled by that, but the idea seems to me to make sense. That this has been found in healthcare issues. Sometimes people who are dealing with a health problem tend to let it spill over into all areas of their life. And it may not necessarily be advantageous to do that. They overgeneralize in a sense. So we're taking the view now that compartmentalization may be psychologically healthy. Again, it depends on your personality, But it's not true, as we used to think, that compartmentalization was always unhealthy. So to have the optimistic explanatory style then, to summarize, don't blame yourself constantly when things go wrong. It's better to believe that it's a temporary setback, that it may last a few weeks or a few months, and then you'll bounce back from it. And also to try to keep it compartmentalized. If in one area of your life you're having problems in health, in terms of relationships, or with money, don't let it spill over into other areas of your life. Try to keep it focused in that narrow area. So based on Seligman's theory, there's been a lot of research on the importance of an optimistic explanatory style. It's very psychologically healthy to have that. So here's a quote I found from Seligman from an interview, where he said that the optimistic explanatory style is the key to persistence. Now they call that grit, the concept in positive psychology. It really just means perseverance and persistence. And I think Seligman is right. If you're optimistic, you're a more persistent, perseverant person. If you're low in optimism, you give up. And as a therapist, I've seen this for many, many years. This is true in relationships. People are having trouble finding the right person for himself or herself. They give up too easily, and they don't persist. And I've tried over the years with people who feel lonely, feel depressed because they don't have someone that they're in love with, or who feel that they have that kind of romantic relationship. They're often very low on optimism. There's nothing wrong with their mind, their personality, their income, but they don't think there's someone out there for them, and they don't try, they don't make the effort. And so it's what we call a self-fulfilling prophecy. And many people are like this. And so I see this, as Adler pointed out, this often shows up in social relationships. They are pessimistic about social relationships. Okay, so let's look at this developmentally. Okay, what do we know about children's optimism? Because it starts from somewhere. We're not suddenly optimistic or pessimistic when we're 21 years old. There are antecedents to this. And it's very important, whether you have children or not, to know where this comes from. Okay, children with high optimism have experienced a parenting style. And this is an important concept now in psychology, parenting style. If you haven't heard this term before, it means that psychologists know that not all parents are the same. You know, something you probably knew when you were kids anyway, that if you visited your friends, their parents weren't the same as your parents. Parents differ. This has been studied in hundreds or thousands of studies, the impact of parenting style. So these are children. If you have an optimistic personality, you grew up with a parenting style that helped you to be optimistic. What did you experience? Your parents encouraged you to try new things, to try different things. I come from a very musical family. It goes back 170 years into my ancestors in Eastern Europe. They've been very well known in the field of music, and this has been transmitted through my children also. It's probably genetic, I would say. So parents can encourage their children to learn an instrument or singing, vocal And if it doesn't work out, you don't blame your child. They can try something else. That would be an example of encouraging children to develop hobbies, to develop interests. Not all parents do that. It's been found that parents who impose rules and restrictions, but at a moderate level. This is something Maslow talked about. It's not very well known. But he was influenced by Adler, by Anna Freud. Some of you may know. Sigmund Freud had a daughter who became very influential in the field of child psychiatry. She was brilliant. And so Maslow was influenced by them and some other people. And he said that children need firm guidance. Children need rules, but they also need the opportunity to try new things. So it's not true that parents who give no rules to their children develop optimistic children. That's not true. Children need a moderate amount of structure or control. Children need to know who the boss is. Now, I don't think that's a problem in Hong Kong, from my understanding with colleagues. Most kids know pretty well that their parents are the boss, but maybe they need a little more freedom in trying new things. Again, there are cultural differences in the research, but children who have moderately strong rules growing up are more likely to be optimistic. Parents who develop moderate control over children's choice of friends and extracurricular activities develop children who are high on optimism. So parents need to know who their friends are, whether they're good for the kids or not, but not to overly police their children. Children need to experience conflict. And one of the things parents should not do is to intervene. When children are not getting along, children have to learn that, how to deal with conflict. Not every friendship is going to last. So parents who exert moderate control are more likely to have children high on optimism. So in other words, when children experience a moderate autonomy while growing up, they're likely to have the highest optimism. Interestingly, research shows that this may even operate at the fetal level. A very new research has shown this. When parents, both physical touch and voice, the fetus is responsive to this. And even at the fetal level, there's an interaction going on between the parent, typically it's the mother, of course, and the fetus. So this is a new area of research, and it may influence optimism. There's research showing that it influences psychological functioning, and this may include optimism at an early age. So this is all consistent with Adler's views. Okay, so now to talk about adults. Psychological research has consistently associated optimism with greater subjective well-being, greater happiness. If you know something about positive psychologists, the psychologist Edward Diener is the father of happiness. He's done dozens and dozens of studies with other psychologists on subjective well-being. So there's no dispute now that optimism is linked with happiness. Happy people are optimistic people. If you want to become happier, become more optimistic. The second area, there's been, as I mentioned, a lot of research linking self-efficacy with optimism. So if you want to become greater in self-efficacy, that means greater confidence that you can handle challenges in life, become more optimistic. People low on optimism have low self-efficacy. They give up too soon. They give up too quickly in school or in career. The third we mentioned very briefly. This comes from the work of Dr. Neff. She's the founder of the study of self-compassion. So it's linked with optimism also. Try to become kinder towards yourself, and you'll become more optimistic. She's found that people low on optimism are very tough on themselves. Again, we talked about this with Seligman's idea of self-explanatory style. People who constantly blame themselves when things don't go right, instead of accepting. One of the things in self-compassion is recognizing that all human beings make mistakes, that you can't go through life being perfect. And there is research on being a perfectionist is not good for your mental health. One of the flaws of sometimes parents have, and I think parents who emphasize high achievement may be stressing perfectionism too much. And it's well-meaning, but it's not healthy. So my father had this tendency. He was a teacher. He taught at the top high school in the United States, the Bronx High School of Science, school that I attended. He taught English there. And I've learned as a parent to avoid that. So if I came home with a 95 out of 100, he would be happy, but he would be more interested in why I missed 5 points. And so when I became a father, I consciously decided I would not do that. And it's true, in life you don't need to be perfect. You can get into the top schools, top Ivy League schools, without getting 100. You need to have very good grades, but you don't need 100. And also it's not realistic. Very few people can be perfect, even academically or at work. So self-compassion is linked to optimism, but again, the idea is that there's a limit to it. Sometimes you need to face your challenges and try to improve yourself. But overall, it's better to be high on self-compassion, and that will help you to be a more optimistic person, but not to be a perfectionist. There's been research on marriage and optimism, and that is clear. If you're optimistic, you can accept conflict and don't feel that there's something wrong with your spouse because you disagree on something. You can accept that. If you're low on optimism, it can be self-fulfilling. You think that things will just get worse. In many long-term healthy marriages, people disagree on certain areas and they accept that, and they can live with that. So to me, that makes sense. Optimistic people don't expect, again, that the marriage can be perfect. There can be complete agreement in every area. Improved health outcomes. So we've talked about this a little. It's better to be moderately high on optimism if you want to have the best physical health. Not to be a 10, but also not to be low if we have a 10-point scale on optimism. And the latest research is on greater longevity. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Okay. When we look at optimism and romantic love, one area is that people who are dating tend to feel that their partner is more supportive if they feel that their partner is optimistic. Again, that would make sense because you feel that conflicts can be handled, they can be resolved. In a conflict conversation, they saw their partner as more engaging. Again, because they don't give up hope. They feel that, okay, we disagree, but let's see if we can work through this. And in a one-year follow-up, men's optimism predicted relationship status, not the women's optimism. So maybe it's a bigger issue for men. As men who are low in optimism may be more prone to anger, or, it's either my way or else. So it seems women are not as more likely to have that view. But if you're a male, then it may be more important to be optimistic that a conflict can be resolved. A disagreement doesn't mean it's the end of the relationship. Because maybe men are more likely to think that it has to be perfect, or there's something wrong with it, something intrinsically wrong with it. Okay, so we're almost finished, because I do want to have some activities that I think can be meaningful, and I'll explain what activities boost optimism. So this was a study that I discovered last week when I was preparing this lecture. It came out this summer from the University of Boston University School of Medicine, which is a very prestigious medical school. And if you look at the numbers, it involved over 69,000 women, and a smaller group, but still a large number, 1,400 men. The women were tracked for 10 years and the men for 30 years. So they had scores on optimism. When the individuals were compared based on their initial levels of optimism, so they looked at the lowest group and the highest group, the most optimistic for both men and women lived an average of about 11 to 15% longer. That might be about 7 or 8 years, so that's a very significant amount. And 50 to 70% greater probability of reaching age 85, those that were on the high optimism. The researchers said they don't have explanations yet. This is when all other factors were controlled for. What was left was the difference between being low on optimism versus being high on optimism. So, as I say here, how would you explain these very powerful findings? Everyone wants to have a long life. I don't know anyone who would say, except for clinically depressed people, that they don't care or not. It doesn't make any difference to them. Oops. Oh, I think. Okay, I actually turned it off, so I need some help. Okay, so thank you. Okay, so here are some possible explanations, and all may be partly true. Optimists take better care of their daily health through beneficial habits, nutrition, exercise, not smoking, not engaged in substance abuse. This we kind of talked about earlier this afternoon with the extremes. Optimists are better able to regulate their negative emotions. This we didn't talk about, such as overcoming anger, anxiety, sadness. And this is a very interesting area of positive psychology. It's an area where I've been doing research, is what strategies do people use to influence their emotions? The best way I can explain this, if you're in a bad mood, how do you get out of the bad mood? And we call this strategies, and I've been studying this. One strategy that people use is music. They listen to music to get out of a bad mood. A second is, what if you want to be in a good mood? You're not unhappy, but you're just not that happy. And how can you put yourself in a better mood? Or let's say you're already in a slightly good mood, but you want to elevate it. And it's been found that this is often people do that through music also. Even more than getting out of a bad mood, people will listen to certain songs that they like on iTunes, this is what I do, or going on YouTube, listening to songs that will bolster their mood. And everyone has different songs. It may have to do with when you were very happy one summer, what songs were popular that summer. It can be very idiosyncratic. But the focus now is on what strategies people use. I did a study that was done in India with some colleagues, with college students. Some people may think of a happy memory that happened when they went out with friends and had a good time. Let's say they went out to dinner, and they think of that memory, and that puts them into a good mood. So it may be that optimistic people do this more often. They have good strategies to influence their emotions. This is a very important area of healthy functioning that's just beginning to be studied now. So they're not looking at people who are clinically depressed. They're not looking at people who suffer from anxiety disorders. They're looking at normal people. What do they do to put themselves in a good mood? Because it has health consequences. It's better for your health to be walking around feeling happy than to be feeling blah. So it may be that optimists are better able to do this. They choose strategies. Sometimes people think of funny movies that they've seen, or maybe, we talked about this earlier this afternoon, thinking about very romantic movies that make them feel more hopeful about their own relationship. If they're having some conflict, they can think about a romantic movie where the people came together at the end of the movie. Pessimistic people probably don't do that. That's what I would guess. They just walk around feeling unhappy. Again, not clinically depressed, but they weren't able to raise their mood. So that would be number 3 here. Number 4, optimists may have greater resilience. So they bounce back better from stress than pessimistic people who stay stuck in this situation that we talked about. They believe they're always going to be unhappy, or that because they were dumped in a romantic relationship that they'll never find anyone else, as opposed to accepting it and moving on. Okay, and it could be, and this goes back to Adler's view, that optimists have more satisfying social relationships. They have more friends, better friendships, better quality friendships, and closer with family members than people who are low on optimism. And the reason then is because over and over again, and this has been influential with Seligman's view, social relationships are a key to psychological well-being. So Seligman didn't start out with this view, but he's come to emphasize it. In the beginning, it was all about happiness. And now, more and more, it's about, do you have close friends? Are you close with your parents? Do you feel your parents can give you advice? Versus being an isolated person. So the field is moving much closer to what Adler talked about 70 years ago, that psychological well-being, psychologically healthy people have good friendships, good social relationships, good family relationships. So being more optimistic helps you to do that. Again, it helps you to accept the fact you can disagree with your family members about things and still be close with them. You can compartmentalize. It doesn't mean you'll always disagree. And pessimistic people are less able to do that. So I think it all comes together. When I finished my preparation for this lecture, I felt satisfied because I felt it all does fit together. It all makes sense. So in the few minutes that we have about 15 minutes. So we can talk about interventions. We can do a couple. So one of the things that's been developed in positive psychology is called expressive writing. And this is a very powerful technique. There are 2 aspects. This will take too much time. We can't do this here in the room, but you can do this tonight. one way to boost your optimism is to write about an unhappy event and do it for 3 or 4 days in a row. Something that you're not happy with, that not necessarily a trauma, but something bad that happened in your life didn't turn out, and express it. Use your emotions to express it. You use feeling words. And so some of us are better than others at using feeling words. I feel sad, I felt rejected, I felt hurt, I felt ashamed, I felt embarrassed. These, not intellectualized, but to use feeling words. The effect might not be at that moment, but it might take a few days or a couple of weeks, but there's very solid research that this boosts optimism. It's kind of the view that Freud talked about catharsis. So Freud was wrong about a lot of things, but he was right about catharsis, that it can be beneficial. So that's what I think this is about. That many people keep these things inside them. They never talk about them with anyone. So if you write about it, it kind of gets it out of your system. Doesn't mean you'll never feel any negativity, but it means it'll be much less. So that's one of the things to boost your optimism, is if you had a negative experience in your life, write about it for 3 or 4 days, for about 20 minutes each time. And by the 4th time, and there's very solid research that this works, okay? You don't have to show it to anyone. And then you can destroy it. But it has a psychologically beneficial effect. This is the leader, Dr. James Pennebaker, who developed this technique. Okay, so these were some examples of research. And the bottom line was, if you look at the last here, it's better if you use positive and optimistic and future-focused language. In other words, if you say this was an upsetting event, but I'm optimistic that it's over, that I'll never see this person again, I'll never go to this school again. Use positive language and future-focused. The future will be brighter because I'll never have to see these people again. I'll never see this person again, that kind of thing. So that's what you want to do. So now it's not clear. Okay, well, the last area is what's called your best possible self. So we can spend a few minutes on that. And I have several handouts there. This is another technique that's been developed. And now it's one of the most well-known interventions in positive psychology. I added my own at the end on travel. But we can do this, at least the first one. This has been the subject of many, many empirical studies. So the basic idea is, we'll start with the first one. Think 10 years from now in the future, and think about what the best possible scenario would be with your family members. So if you have children, they'll be 10 years older. They won't be children anymore unless they're infants now. They might be teenagers, or they might be adults. Your parents will be 10 years older. Siblings, if you have siblings, will be. So write a paragraph about what the ideal situation would be. So again, let's do that now for a couple of minutes. If everything turns out as wonderful as you would hope, and so again, the empirical evidence is very strong. This really works. And I'm starting with family life because I know in Chinese culture, and I think this is very positive, family life is a very important value. So I'm starting with this deliberately, and there are others that we'll take a quick look at. But we should start with the family, the best possible situation, best possible scenario that you could picture. Again, it could be a few sentences. Okay, I'm going to move on, and of course you can finish this tonight or when you leave, but I'd like to touch on some of these at least, so you have a sense or flavor of what we're doing. So the second one would be career. So some of you are still in school, but in 10 years from now, you won't be in school anymore. Even if you're planning to go into medical school, in 10 years you'll have finished all of that. Or a PhD, it'll be done. Again, we're talking about best possible scenario. So, in other words, often they ask this in job interviews in the United States to say how you see yourself 5 years from now or 10 years from now. But this is further out. This would be long range. So if you're starting your career or you're still in school, but try to describe the best possible scenario in terms of a particular career. Okay? And so do that. We'll just start that, at least with a couple of sentences. It could be where you're living, whether you're here in Hong Kong or somewhere else. What's your job title? You could have your salary. That's important for most people. I think it should be that they're experiencing a good income. And again, it should be realistic. So we talked about this. Having realistic optimism. I don't think they would say that if you say that the idea would be that you'll have won the Nobel Prize for chemistry. I wouldn't recommend you put that. You could say that you're a very successful, active researcher at a top university. Okay. Going beyond that might be getting to unrealistic optimism. Okay, a third one now, very important, is health. So that includes mental health. Those of you who have been here all afternoon, you've heard several hours of what positive psychology knows about ideal psychological functioning and physical health. So describe how you would see your ideal self, mentally and physically. Okay, again, as I say, if you're still working, you can certainly finish this when we finish today. Okay, fourth has to do with romantic love. So if you're in a relationship now, or if you're not, what would be the ideal for you in 10 years from now? The best possible scenario for you. Okay, a fifth one is hobbies. And actually there's a lot of interest now in positive psychology in that. It turns out that people with a lot, basically that means interests. It could be playing a musical instrument. Not everyone has that interest. It could be taking art classes, photography, painting, dance. There are many, many sports. But there's a lot of research coming out that it's psychologically healthy to have different interests. In positive psychology, this is being called curiosity. And there's a lot of very interesting research that people who are curious are psychologically healthier and have better romantic love relationships. In particular, and I tell this to my students, women find men more attractive when they're highly curious, have a lot of interest, rather than being boring to be around. And there is scientific research on this. So it starts at dating and it continues through marriage. And this has serious consequences. In other words, wives get bored more quickly in the marriage than husbands do. I'm not saying this is good or bad, but this is the reality. And I've asked my students if they can explain this in terms of evolutionary biology. Why are men more content in a marriage than women? Women get bored more quickly with their husband than men do. And as they say, there's been research in dating relationships too. So having a lot of hobbies and interests, both for men and women, is associated with greater psychological well-being. Very interesting. So having said that, what would your ideal be 10 years from now? Some of you might want to learn a musical instrument, or if you already play an instrument, most people who play one instrument usually learn a second or third, because I think it's a kind of inborn talent. You could be that you'd like to learn a foreign language that you don't know, or you'd like to take up painting. There are many hobbies and interests. Could be a sport that you don't do. Maybe you want to learn to play golf or something. But put that down. Again, it's not going to happen overnight, but 10 years from now, what kinds of hobbies or interests would you like to picture that you've learned that you don't have now? But as I say, this is becoming an important area in positive psychology, having different hobbies and interests. Usually it was thought of in the past as being trivial, but that's not true. Okay, we'll end pretty quickly. Time's almost up. Number 6 is social life. So this would be friendships, colleagues at work. So this is separate from family, separate from marriage. So in 10 years from now, what would you like to see as a quality of your social life? Separate from those areas, from with your parents or siblings, children, and marriage. So all of these build up your optimism when you do this. They really work. Just writing down your best possible future. And the last one I added, based on the study that I'm doing now with some colleagues in China, we just finished collecting data. I have to tell you, it's very exciting. I think this is the first study which connects travel and optimism. And we found extremely powerful correlations. In other words, people high on optimism have greater motivation to travel than other people. in many areas having to do with travel. Do you want to travel to see the world? Do you want to travel to become a more cultured person? Do you want to travel to become more successful in your career because you learn more about the world? Our world is becoming more globally interconnected. Well, it turns out that optimism plays a very important part in that. So this I suggested, maybe in 3 years from now, where would you like to have traveled to? Or how much traveling would you like to be doing? So 10 years seems very hard to predict, but in 3 years, if you've never been to the United States, you might want to visit, or if you've never been to some other part of the world. So that would be a 7th category, because as I say, it seems that optimism and travel seem to be linked. Okay. The last thing, which I didn't mention, I'll just touch on it. Seligman developed a technique called learned optimism, and it's very useful. I describe it in my handout. Basically, what you do for 3 weeks is to keep a diary and write about something that happened each day that turned out more optimistically than you expected. That's what you do. And he found that this, and his colleagues, that this boosts people optimism. In a way, it's training your mind to think more optimistically. And this is what I have found. Many people are just in a mind habit of not thinking optimistically. Either they think about the worst things that can happen, which you already know by the end of this afternoon is not psychologically healthy, or they never think about the best things that can happen. And so they cheat themselves in a way. As a therapist, this is what I often would tell people. It doesn't cost you anything to look at the best possible future. Some psychologists have said, if you want to dream big. It doesn't cost you anything more than dreaming small. Adler never would have gotten to where he did if he dreamed small. As they say, he came from a very uninfluential, unknown family to become a world leader in his field. Because he did dream big, he did have this ambition. And as a therapist, I tell people, you may as well dream big because you don't lose anything by it. So all of this ties into what we've been talking about this afternoon. Anyway, thanks for inviting me this afternoon for these presentations. I'm very happy to spend a few minutes if you do have some questions before we end today. So if any of you have any thoughts or comments, I'm very willing to stay for a few more minutes.